how attendees go on. Welcome everyone to our presentation on the ins and outs of recertifications for government contractors. I'm Sam Finnerty. I'm a partner in the government contracts practice group at PilieroMazza. I counsel a lot of small businesses and government contractors with compliance issues arising under federal acquisition regulation and SBA's small business regulations and joint venture regulations. I help a lot of companies navigate the bid process process at GAO and Court of Federal Claims, work with a lot of small businesses to both file and defend against size and status protests. I've also got a lot of experience working with resolving claims and appeals under the Contract Disputes Act and general business torts as well, working on REAs and counseling clients with some of the nuanced issues that arise under SBA regulations like limitations on subcontracting. Today's topic, recertification, past performance valuations, and challenging those through CPARS claims, OCIs, security clearances, as well as helping clients navigate the SBA affiliation regulations and how to mitigate and maintain their size status as they grow. I'll tell you a little bit about our firm, PilieroMazza. We are a business law firm that works with government contractors and commercial businesses across the United States in a number of different industries. We help clients with a lot of the things that I just expressed experience working with. In addition, we have a full service litigation group, a labor and employment group, and a business and transactions group that sort of allows us to become a one-stop shop for a lot of our clients. Our labor and employment team has a lot of experience working on Surface Contract Act and Davis-Bacon, wage termination issues, things like that that are unique to government contracting. Our business and transactions group does a lot of work with clients as they're going through mergers and acquisitions and novating contracts and fun things like that. And we help a lot of clients sort of get their business affairs in order as it relates to setting up their subcontracting agreements, their teaming agreements, joint ventures, and should any disputes arise with partners, teaming partners, subcontractors, things like that. Our litigation group is well suited to help out. So today we're going to be talking about not only the initial certifications that government contractors have to make when they go after certain procurements, but also the recertifications they have to make during the life cycle of those contracts and as it relates to certain events that might trigger recertification. We're going to also be talking about how you might be able to utilize information available to perhaps file protests if you think that a company is running afoul of these rules or is holding itself out to have a specific size status that it's not eligible for on a given contractor. We're also going to talk about some of the landmines that you need to avoid to make sure that you are properly certifying and recertifying and adhering to these regulations as you're pursuing different government contracts, as you're setting up joint ventures and teaming with other companies and pursuing different business opportunities that are available to you. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to talk about, the importance of adhering to these rules because there are significant consequences for making false certifications, which I'm going to touch on as well. So the first thing I want to discuss today is sort of the regulatory background here that underpins the recertification rules, which is the rules requiring certification in general. The federal acquisition regulation requires that offerors have to be registered in the System for Reward Management, known as SAM, when they submit an offer or a quotation. There are some exceptions to that where you don't have to be in SAM, and those are things like purchases that are under the micro purchase threshold. If there's a classified contract and being registered that somehow compromise national security or things like that. And certain contracts that are being performed outside of the continental United States. But in general, you've got to be in SAM and you have to comply with the FAR's annual reps and certs requirements. And it's important to know that when you submit an offer, you're verifying that the reps and certs that you've filled out in SAM have been updated in the last 12 months and that they are current, accurate, and complete, except for any changes that you might identify specifically in your offer. And unless the acquisition is exempt for some of those reasons I discussed, then when a contracting officer is going through the procurement process, they're required to verify that you're registered in SAM at the time of your submission. And another thing to note here, although you could do an entire other presentation on joint ventures, is that joint ventures pursuing government contracts need to also individually be registered in SAM. It's a common question that comes up. And so it's not just enough that the members of the JV are registered. The JV itself has to actually have separate registration. So some of the specific reps and certs that you make in SAM, there are a couple different FAR clauses. There's reps and certs for commercial items, and there's small business program representations. The small business program representations require that you verify your size status for all the NAICS codes that you've identified as doing business under, and that you have to check the box in SAM to indicate whether you hold any specific small business or socioeconomic status. So you've got to confirm whether you're a small business, whether you're a SDB, a veteran-owned small business, a service-disabled veteran-owned small business, women-owned, hub zone, or if you're, a joint venture under any of those last three: women-owned, economically disadvantaged, women-owned, or hub zone joint venture. For veteran-owned small businesses and SDB OSBs, they're moving away from self-certification, so-called check-the-box certification, in January of 2023. So we've got a little time remaining here, but after that point, SBA is going to be the entity that will be certifying those types of concerns. It'll no longer be a self-certification. So, you get your company set up at SAM, you make all your annual reps and certs, you make your small business socioeconomic status representation and your representations for the various NAICS codes within which you do business. The ongoing requirement is that you review and update your reps and certs as necessary, but at least annually, to ensure that they're accurate and complete. But the general rule is this is usually done on a one-year basis. You go in, you revise your reps and certs, and those reps and certs are then effective for a year. But that is a requirement under the FAR that you are making those annual updates. And if you represent that you are a small business in connection with the pursuit of a contract, a set-aside contract, you also, and this is going to be what we're going to be mainly talking about today, is not just this annual representation requirement, but you have to also re-represent or recertify in accordance with FAR 52.219-28 and SBA's recertification rule, which is 13 CFR 121.404 G. And we're going to talk about what those specific clauses require as far as when you have to recertify and what the effect of those recertifications is. I also just wanted to announce to the group that I will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. So if any of you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat box, and I will get through as many of them as I can at the end. So first, we're going to talk about the FAR's re-representation rule. This is included in a lot of contracts, and it's one of those FAR, one of those innumerable FAR clauses that is just sort of usually thrown in all set-aside contracts. And it's important that you know specifically what this clause means when it's in your contract, because when it's in your contract, that means that it's going to impose a contractual obligation on your part to comply with this clause. And this clause has been tinkered with over the years. It's important to note that the recertification rules, since they relate to size and things related to eligibility or socioeconomic status and size status, they're really within the purview of the Small Business Administration. And so SBA has promulgated its recertification rules. And SBA is sort of the arbiter of all things size related. So if there was ever an issue and someone filed a size protest, SBA is going to ultimately use their rules when they're analyzing whether you did or didn't comply with these. But the FAR has its own set of re-representation rules, which are drafted to essentially model SBA's recertification rules, but confusion often arises because the FAR is updated on a much slower basis than SBA regulations. So the SBA recertification rules have been tinkered with a lot over the last 5-6 years, and the FAR is usually on a 5-6 year lag just to get caught up to the most recent SBA rules. So the current version of the FAR is probably 5 or 6 years behind where SBA's rules are. So there are some differences between them that we're going to talk about today. But this really outlines what the FAR rule is, which says that a small business has to re-represent its size and socioeconomic status. That was added somewhat recently to the regulation. This rule used to just require size re-representation. Now it also requires that you re-represent socioeconomic status. And you have to do it generally at 3 different points in time. Within 30 days after you execute a novation agreement, within 30 days after you go through a merger, sale, or acquisition that does not require contract novation, and if we're talking about a long-term contract, one that exceeds 5 years, then you have to re-represent your size and socioeconomic status under the FAR 60 to 120 days prior to the end of the 5th year of that contract, and then also 60 to 120 days prior to the date upon which any further option under that contract is going to be exercised. So to back up a little bit, the requirement that you re-represent within 30 days of a contract novation, that would be if you transferred your contract legally. Normally it's impermissible to sell a contract, but the government can recognize a entity as the successor in interest to another entity, and thereby allow entity to transfer its government contract to a different business. So within 30 days of that type of arrangement being finalized, the company that now holds the contract has to re-represent its size and socioeconomic status. So how exactly do you go about doing this under the FAR? Well, the requirement in the regulation is that if you go through any of those events, either a novation, a merger, or a sale, or you are re-representing in connection with a long-term contract, you've got to go into SAM and update your reps and certs and any other applicable data in SAM. You have to make sure that that information is all current, and then you have to also notify the contracting officer in writing within the timeframes that we just talked about, which are 30 days for novation, merger, and 60 to 120 days with respect to long-term contracts, and the 5-year mark on those contracts and the exercise of options thereunder. So it's not just a simple exercise of going into SAM, but when you go through, I often refer to these events as triggering events, or events that trigger a recertification requirement. When you go through these types of events, you have to actually go a step further of informing the contracting officer for any contract that would be captured by this clause, any contract that has this representation term in it, which is going to be, your set-aside contracts, not your full and open contracts, unless you were awarded a full and open contract as a small business. So you go through one of these triggering events, you update SAM, you inform the contracting officer, perhaps as a result of the contract being novated to a different entity. That new entity performing the contract is not small or doesn't hold the applicable socioeconomic status. maybe you go through a merger or acquisition and now you're no longer small, or it's been 5 years that you've been performing on a long-term contract, and when you were awarded the contract, you were a small business, but now here we are 5 years later, and you've just organically grown as a business, not through innovation or a merger, but you're now no longer small, and you recertify that you're no longer small. Well, the million-dollar question is, what does that mean? What's the effect of representing and informing the agency that, hey, we're no longer a small business for this contract that you awarded, where size or status was the basis for the award. So if you do that, the black and white impact under the FAR is that the agency can no longer include the value of any options exercised, modifications issued, orders issued, or purchases, if we're talking about a blanket purchase agreement, under that contract towards its small business contracting goals. That would include if it were, if socioeconomic status was at issue and you represented a hub zone and now you're no longer a hub zone, well, then they couldn't take hub zone credit anymore, or they couldn't take, SDVOSB credit, things like that. And within 30 days after you make this re-representation, the agency, the procuring agency, is supposed to issue a modification to the contract that captures your re-representation, and they're also supposed to report the re-representation in the Federal Procurement Database, FPDS, and they're supposed to update your size status in FPDS. So the next thing we're going to touch on here is the SBA's recertification rule, which is a little bit different than the FAR. Like I said, the SBA rules have been updated with a lot more frequency over the last few years, so they have some more nuanced requirements and an extra level of detail that the FAR just doesn't have. So at bottom, there are similar requirements in that SBA's rules require recertification if you go through a novation, merger, sale, acquisition, or if you have a long-term contract. Those are generally the same. You've got to recertify in connection with innovation within 30 days, merger, sale, acquisition, 30 days. There's a little bit of difference here because the FAR says within 60 to 120 days, and SBA says no more than 120 days. So you can't certify any more than that, whereas the FAR has a slightly different time requirement. You've also got to recertify if the contracting officer explicitly requires recertification in connection with an order. So if you've got an IDIQ contract, general rule is that your size is maintained and your size and status are maintained for the life of the contract. But on an IDIQ contract, the agency can always choose to expressly require that you recertify in connection with an order. So that can, impact obviously your eligibility if you've experienced growth during the performance of a long-term contract and you were small, but 2 years later you're not, and you're still trying to use that contract to go after set-aside orders. Well, if they expressly require recertification in connection with that order, it's going to be an order that you're unfortunately not eligible to go after. So there is some additional detail here that's important to discuss as it relates to the requirement that you recertify in connection with mergers, sales, and acquisitions. And so these are mergers and sales when novation is not required. So if you are merged or sold, or you acquire an entity, and the simplest way to describe it is, for example, let's say you are acquired by another entity and you are held as a wholly owned subsidiary of that entity. Well, then you don't have to actually novate your contracts to the company that acquired you. You can continue to perform them in your name because you survived the acquisition. But if you didn't survive the acquisition and you novated your contracts, well, then the rule that just requires that you recertify within 30 days of a novation will kick in. But if we're dealing with a sale, merger, or acquisition where there's no contract novation, the requirement to recertify is either when a concern or an affiliate of a concern is acquired by another concern. And the entities that are required expressly to recertify are both the acquired concern and the acquiring concern, assuming each of them has been awarded a small business contract. Recertification is also required under the SBA rules from a joint venture. And in this case, it has to be from the partner to the joint venture that has been acquired or is acquiring or has been merged with another entity. So just a quick discussion on joint venture recertification. This can be kind of complicated because you have two, let's just say simply you have two partners that are members of a joint venture, and you want to determine, how the joint venture itself recertifies. Well, the SBA rules say that if one of the members of the joint venture experiences one of these triggering events, then the joint venture's requirement to recertify only requires that that entity recertify. The other member that, perhaps hasn't gone through any triggering events, they don't have to also resubmit their size status. So this is important because you could be in a situation where, you are a mentor-protege joint venture, and let's say the protege has grown during the lifetime of the joint venture to exceed the size standard on a long-term contract that the joint venture was awarded. And then let's say the mentor, the large business, goes through some merger or acquisition and it acquires some other large business or some other small business. And that company has always been large. So here it's recertifying, that it's essentially still large. But the protege, who was small and now isn't large, that company doesn't also have to recertify. So it gets a little complicated, but there's basically a carve out there to recognize that we don't want to punish organic growth. Essentially, we have these recertification rules to trigger that the procuring agency be updated when small businesses are going through these events that can be growth through acquisition, what's called inorganic growth, things like that. So another additional rule in the SBA regulations is that you have to recertify on pending proposals if you go through a merger or sale or an acquisition. So if you submit a bid and then while that bid is outstanding, you go through an acquisition, you have to recertify to the contracting officer prior to award of that contract. And this was a new rule that was recently added that basically says if the deal, including agreements in principle, occurs within 180 days of when you submitted your offer and award still hasn't been made, and you're unable to recertify as small, so you submit a bid, let's say 90 days later, you go through an acquisition and you're now not small, and you inform the agency that you're now not small. Since that deal occurred within 180 days, the regulation says you're not eligible anymore to get that small business contract. However, if the deal occurs more than 180 days after you submitted your initial bid, then the regulation says that the contracting officer can still award the contract. You're still eligible for the set aside, but the agency, in awarding the contract to you, then just can't take small business credit for that award. So there's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to get into some of the details here though as we go along. So, what we know for sure about SBA regulations with respect to what the effect of recertification is that, like the FAR, if you recertify as small, well then from that point going forward, the agency can't take small business credit for the options orders issued from that point going forward, and the agency and the contractor have to revise all applicable federal contract databases like SAM to reflect the new size or socioeconomic status. Also important to note that if you've got multiple award IDIQ type contracts, task order contracts, and you recertify as small or your socioeconomic status of the contract changes, there could be what are called off-ramping provisions, which contracting officers are allowed to put into contracts. These are discussed SBA's regulations. And these off-ramping provisions would really trump what we've discussed today regarding the effect of recertification under FAR and under SBA regulations. So if you've got a contract, you've got to always, in addition to keeping apprised of what the rules and requirements are under the regulations, you've got to make sure you know the terms of your contract, specifically because those contractual provisions take precedence. And an off-ramping provision, which is not uncommon, these sometimes exist in large vehicles like Oasis and things like that, where it'll basically say, if you go through an acquisition or merger and you recertify as other than small, then, as an example, you're placed into dormant status and you're not allowed to bid any new work under the contract vehicle. You're allowed to complete performance on any outstanding task orders you have, but you can't bid anything new. And once you finish performing any current orders you have, your contract will then be terminated for convenience. And that's the off ramp, so they ramped off the contract. So it's just important to look through your contracts and to be aware that there could be other unique provisions that impose consequences for recertification that are perhaps more severe than what the regulations themselves say. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, if a contracting officer explicitly requires that you recertify in response to a task order, then SBA is going to determine your size as of the date that you submit your offer for that task order. So, that would sort of change the analysis if you were operating under the general assumption that if you bid, a long-term IDIQ type contract and you're small when you bid it, but then you organically grow over, the 5 years that you're performing that contract. The general rule is that you maintain your size and status for the life of the contract. So even though you might have grown, your size certification would relate back to when you initially certified your size when you bid the IDIQ. But if the CO explicitly requests that you recertify in connection with a task order, well, then that's an exception to that general rule, and your size is going to be determined when you bid the task order. A disclosure on 8A contracts. The general rule is that if an 8A entity's ownership or control changes, then any 8A contracts that have been awarded to that company will be terminated for convenience unless the SBA administrator issues a waiver of that termination for convenience rule, which I'm not going to get into all the specifics of when a waiver might be warranted, but there are some exceptions and ways you might be able to still keep your contract alive. So, backing up to what I talked about how a contracting officer can explicitly request recertification in connection with a task order. Another thing that's important is to understand what that looks like when a task order recertification has been made, what that sort of language and analysis around that is, because it has to be, according to SBA regulations, the request has to be explicit, and the request has to include the size standard in effect at the time of recertification that corresponds to the overlying, IDIQ multiple award contract vehicle. So this is sort of a gray area. It's not black and white rules on what an explicit recertification request looks like, but there is some case law that indicates that, just checking the box on the SF 1449 that, indicates that the contract is set aside, the task order is set aside, that's not enough to satisfy the requirement for explicit recertification request. And including the standard FAR clause that we've been talking about today that requires representation of small business status during performance in connection with innovations, mergers, and things like that. Just including those clauses in the task order solicitation, that's not enough to constitute an explicit recertification request. But at the same time, while the regulation says the request has to be explicit, the request doesn't have to necessarily use the words certify or recertify. So you can't just do, a control F search through a solicitation to see if those trigger words are in there and then conclude that, nope, those aren't in there, so the task order isn't requesting recertification. It's sort of a more totality of the circumstances test, where OHA looks at whether the solicitation can, as a whole, be reasonably understood as requesting recertification at the task order level. And in tracking not only the language in the solicitation, GAO has also indicated that an agency's amendment to a solicitation through a Q&A, that can also be an area where a request becomes explicit for recertification. So look through the Q&As, make sure you're fully aware if you're not small and you've got an IDIQ vehicle and you think your size and socioeconomic status are going to be essentially grandfathered in. Make sure that when you're going after task orders, you are making sure that you're aware as to whether there is a recertification request being made. Sometimes an example of something that could be possibly construed as an explicit request for recertification that doesn't use the words certify or recertify would be a task order where the agency says bids are being solicited from small businesses, entities which are small as of the date that they submit their bid for this task order. That's language that could be viewed as the agency essentially saying, you got to be small, not just when you bid the IDIQ, perhaps years ago, you've got to be small the day you bid this task order. So we're going to talk a little bit now about some issues that are a little less clear under SBA's regulations. And first I want to touch on, one question that comes up a lot is these requirements say that you've got to recertify, but exactly what contracts have to be recertified? Because under the SBA regulation, it's not enough to just go in and update SAM. You've got to actually recertify to the procuring agency. So the rule that requires recertification in connection with novation, it says that the contractor has to recertify to the procuring agency, and if they are other than small, the agency can no longer count the options or orders issued pursuant to the contract. So the language that I was stressing there, which is underlined on the slide presentation, the way that's all worded to me suggests that the recertification is limited to the novated contract and the procuring agency for that novated contract. Essentially, the contractor that the contract is transferred to by way of a novation, by my reading of this regulation, they don't have to also recertify their legacy contracts, which are essentially, all their pre-existing contracts that they had as of the day that the novation went through. So, small business novates its contracts to another small business, or perhaps they novated to a business that is a large business, but has only recently become large and has a bunch of small business contracts in its portfolio. And that small business that gets this contract novated to it wants to be sure, well, hey, wait a minute, I've got to go up the chain of command here now and inform procuring agencies that I'm no longer small. I don't want to have to make a broad disclosure if I don't have to. Well, this regulation can be read to suggest that you really, the requirement is specific to the novated contract. So you wouldn't have to, go and inform your other procuring agencies for your other unaffected contracts that you're no longer small. So continuing this line of reasoning a little bit here, we get to the next part of the rule, which is the requirements to recertify in connection with a merger, sale, or acquisition. And this rule is written much more broadly, so I don't think you have the same protections as you have under a recertification that's being made in connection with a novation, because this rule says that recertification is required from the acquired concern and the acquiring concern, to the extent each of them has small business contracts. So essentially both parties to the deal have to recertify all their small business contracts after a deal like this. Now, a tip here, which would really take the recertification out of this rule, is that if you're going through an asset purchase where you are actually novating a contract, let's say you're acquiring all of the assets of another business, but you're not acquiring the business. You're just acquiring either substantially all of the assets or all of the assets used for performance of a contract. And then their contract is going to be novated to you. You could structure that deal in a way where you're getting all of those assets, but you're doing a novation. So you would be under that type of deal would be caught by the novation recertification requirement and not by the merger, sale, or acquisition recertification requirement. Another thing to keep in mind here, just a little bit of confusion, because this rule has been tinkered with a lot over the years. It was revised a few years ago to require recertification from the acquired concern, acquiring concern, and affiliates, but SBA didn't effectively institute the change that affiliates recertify, because the way that they wrote the regulation, it says there's a part of the rule that says when recertification is required, and it says when a concern or an affiliate of the concern acquires or is acquired by another concern. So the word affiliate is used there, but that is really just setting up when recertification is required. The rule then goes on to discuss from whom recertification is required, and when discussing whom recertification is required from, it only says the acquired concern and the acquiring concern. It doesn't close the loop and also say the affiliate. So, based on that, it could be argued that they didn't effectively modify the rules such that an affiliate acquisition triggers recertification. This is not, a rule this is not an interpretation that has been tested. So there's certainly risk there with taking that reading of the regulations, but just note that there's a little bit of confusion as it relates to how affiliate transactions trigger recertification requirements under the SBA rules. So another really important topic is how recertification affects long-term multiple award, IDIQ type contracts. And this has been something that has been the subject of a lot of debate over the last few years. It was, widely believed by many that if you recertified as other than small in connection with a merger, sale, or acquisition, then not only was the procuring agency precluded from taking small business credit from that point going forward, but also you were no longer eligible to keep bidding task orders set aside under those vehicles. At the same time, it was widely believed by others in the industry that the regulation only spoke to precluding agencies from taking credit, and if you recertified as other than small in connection with a merger, sale, or acquisition, then you were still eligible, because the general rule is that you maintain your size and status for the life of the contract. That interpretation came under some fire. Back in 2018, there was a SDVOSB status protest filed. A company was on Oasis, and they had been acquired by a non-veteran-owned entity, and then they had kept bidding SDVOSB set-aside orders under their Oasis vehicle. Someone filed a protest, alleged that because they should have recertified in connection with their acquisition by a non-service disabled veteran-owned company, they should have recertified, and then they would have not have been eligible for the order. There was a determination rendered at the SBA level agreeing with that interpretation that they weren't eligible for the Oasis task orders, and they then appealed that to OHA. OHA then reversed and said, no, the way the rule is written, recertification only affects agencies' ability to take credit. It doesn't also affect your pre-existing eligibility to keep bidding orders set aside under those vehicles. That decision led to some rule changes. It led SBA to tinker with the regulations a little bit more, which created a little bit more confusion because the way that the word in the regulations was revised wasn't entirely clear. So it got really confusing for a number of years, but I wanted to flag this case that came out at the end of the year last year, where something similar happened. The appellant in this OHA appeal argued that the awardee of 2 task orders under GSA's OASIS Small Business Pool 5 contract was ineligible for award because they'd merged with a private equity firm less than a month after they submitted their bid. They argued that this merger triggered an obligation to recertify and rendered them ineligible for award. In arguing that ineligible for award angle, they relied on that new SBA rule that I touched on a few slides ago that says if a merger, sale, or acquisition occurs within 180 days of when you bid and you're unable to recertify as small, then you're not eligible to receive the contract. Surprisingly, OHA denied the appeal, although that rule seems pretty clear that if what happens, like what happened in this case, you go through an acquisition within 180 days, then you're ineligible. But OHA denied the appeal, and they cited to another part of the SBA regulation, which provides that while SBA's provisions of the recertification rules, including the one that the appellant relied on there, that 180-day rule, as I call it, while those rules apply to multiple award contracts, this part of SBA's regulations says that if the multiple award contract was set aside for small business, then in the case of novation, merger, or acquisition, where no novation is required, i.e. what happens to the appellant here, and the contractor is other than small, the agency cannot count any new orders issued pursuant to the contract from that point forward. So in this case, OHA requested comments from SBA, and SBA argued that the provision I just quoted is actually an exception, which makes clear that when the underlying contract we're talking about is a set-aside multiple award contract, even if you recertify as other than small within 180 days of offer in connection with a merger or acquisition, then you are actually still eligible for pending and future orders. And the only effect is that the agency can't take credit for those orders towards small business goals. Some of the operative language here from the decision was that OHA said that if the appellant's interpretation was correct, then the rule that I quoted a couple of minutes ago would become largely meaningless, because there would not be a need to clarify in a regulation that a procuring agency can't take credit for new orders following a merger or acquisition where the entity recertified was other than small, if that entity wasn't even eligible to bid those orders in the first instance. So essentially, you wouldn't need to clarify, agency, you can't take credit, if the rule was, contractor, you're not eligible to bid in the first place. If the contractor is not eligible to bid in the first place, well, then there's no reason to even talk about credit, because there's not going to be any contract awards and there's not going to be any dispute about taking credit. This decision was then essentially reiterated more recently at the beginning of this year, where OHA again denied for similar reasons another appellant's argument that a prime contractor who recertifies as other than small in connection with a merger or acquisition is not eligible to receive a small business set-aside award. Again, on the slide here, these cases pretty much harken back to that 2018 case I mentioned, where OHA reached the same conclusion, but it was, under a different version of SBA's rules. They've been tweaked a bunch since 2018, and those tweaks have called into question whether OHA would reach the same conclusion it reached back in 2018 if it were presented with this same question under the current version of the rules. And so these cases basically underscore the point that under SBA's current recertification rules, a firm that recertifies as other than small in connection with a triggering event, like a novation, a merger, or an acquisition, will not by itself be precluded from being eligible to bid on set-aside orders that are issued under long-term contracts, IDIQ type contracts, that contractor held prior to the date of recertification. So, how does all of this sort of factor into protests and protest considerations? It's important that you know the deadlines for when a size protest has to be submitted, or a status protest has to be submitted to SBA. These essentially can be filed at 3 different dates, essentially prior to the close of the 5th day after the contracting officer has notified the protester of the identity of the prospective awardee, either for a contract, an order issued against a multiple award contract where size recertification was specifically requested, or for the awardee for an order or BPA set aside where the underlying multiple award contract was awarded on an unrestricted basis, except if we're talking about orders or BPAs issued under GSA schedule contracts. So to unpack that a little bit, the reason that you can protest within 5 days of being informed of the awardee for a task order. You can only do that if it's a task order where recertification was requested in connection with that task order. Otherwise, you can't protest the awardee's size, because the awardee's size certification was made, way back when they bid the IDIQ contract, because the general rule is that they maintain that size for the life of the contract. And this third rule was added somewhat recently because small businesses were pursuing unrestricted multiple award contracts, and they were checking the box when they did it, indicating that they were small or held a certain socioeconomic status. And then, years down the road, under that unrestricted vehicle, the procuring agency was issuing orders on a set-aside basis. And at that point in time, competitors were looking and saying, they had reason in connection with that type of order to question the awardee's size status, but they didn't really have any reason to question it at the IDIQ level, because the IDIQ was unrestricted. So, size really wasn't a factor in making the award. So SBA saw that as a sort of a hole in the regulations. So they added this rule saying that you can protest any order or BPA set aside under an unrestricted IDIQ contract. You can also protest within 5 days of a size recertification made in connection with the issuance of an option period on a long-term contract. The sort of disclaimer there is that it's going to be pretty hard most of the time to know when another company is specifically making its recertification in connection with a long-term contract option, because they're going to be doing that, within 60 to 120 days prior to that option being exercised. That's a pretty big window of time. So it's, unlikely that you're going to be able to file a protest and just hit it dead on where you filed that protest within 5 days of when they made that recertification. Another disclaimer here is that contracting officer is not required to, even if you do file that type of a protest in connection with the option for a long-term contract, the CO would not be required to terminate the contract if the concern was found to be other than small, if you file a protest in connection with an option period being issued. Another thing to note is it is, however, there's no time limits rather for either SBA or the contracting officer themselves to initiate a size protest. And since untimely size protests, all size protests have to be forwarded to SBA, there could still be reasons to file a size protest, even if you're pretty sure that you're untimely, because you think you've got really good arguments, or you're pointing out something really egregious that looks like there's some company out there that's, somehow taking advantage of the set-aside programs, holding themselves out to be small when they're clearly not. Even if you're untimely in the pursuit of that protest, it's possible, since the protest has to be forwarded to SBA, that SBA might see your protest and decide to take up the protest on their own. Or maybe the contracting officer will see it and they'll decide to take it up on their own, and that could result in an adverse size determination that gives you then the ability to be next in line for award. So there's lots of strategies of how you navigate these protest rules and use them to your advantage. So, with that in mind, what are some of the mistakes that competitors could be making that could lead to size protests? It's possible that a competitor in representing as small for a given procurement, they might be failing in representing as small to account for either revenues or employees of companies they're affiliated with. You've got to, your size not only includes your size as a company, but also the receipts or employees of any companies you're affiliated with. And, it's possible that they might not be properly capturing former affiliates if they haven't properly fractured the affiliation with, businesses that they've sold or things like that. If it wasn't done under the, the proper utilization of spinning off subsidiaries and divisions, if it wasn't done correctly, then it's possible that even though they sold a piece of their business, they still have to include the receipts of that business when they're calculating their size. They might have revenues that are still coming in with respect to a novated contract, or a company that just acquired a contract now has to count those revenues from that contract on their books, so they might be failing to properly account for those. Another common one is companies failing to properly include in their receipts revenues that they're receiving from joint ventures they're involved in. Or a company just might simply miscalculate its size. They might get it wrong. They might not understand when size is being determined, what the look back period is, how affiliation works, and whether maybe they've got ties to other companies. They might not be properly representing themselves on their websites. There might be outdated information up there. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you have poorly drafted teaming agreements or joint venture agreements, poorly drafted teaming agreement can lead to affiliation between you and your subcontractor, depending on how much control the small business is ceding to perhaps a large business subcontractor. That could lead to a finding of affiliation under the ostensible subcontractor rule. And joint venture agreements, if you're in a joint venture and you're in a joint venture with your mentor, you're in SBA's mentor protege program, if your joint venture agreement doesn't strictly adhere to SBA's regulations, then that in and of itself can be a finding for affiliation between you and your mentor that could result in you guys being ineligible for award. So to wrap things up today, I want to talk about what the ramifications are if you run afoul of these rules and you make a false certification, because there are pretty significant consequences, although the facts and circumstances of whether you have culpability and liability under these rules depends very specifically on your circumstances. So it's just important to be aware, though, of what these ramifications are. The False Claims Act indicates that you get essentially a penalty of no less than $11,181 per violation, plus 3 times the amount of damages that the government sustains. There's what's known as the presumed loss rule, and every small business set-aside contract, there's what's called a presumption of loss to the government if there's been a false certification. And that presumption of loss is based on the total amount that the government expended on the contract whenever it's established that the business concern that made this, alleged false certification as to their size status in connection with the pursuit of that contract, if they willfully sought and received the award by a misrepresentation, then the potential penalty there could be the total amount for the contract that has been expended on the contract. So, you get caught and liability is found years down the road, and you've been performing a small business contract, and it's determined that you willfully sought and received it by misrepresentation, and the agency at that point in time has expended, $5 million on your contract. Well, the damages in that case that you owe to the government could very well be that presumed loss there of $5 million. So there's 3 different sets of penalties under the rule. If you're found to violate this, you can get suspended or debarred from federal contracting. There's also civil penalties under the False Claims Act, the Program Fraud Civil Remedy Act, and other laws. And there's also potential for criminal penalties here. The presumption of loss rule penalty, that depends on actually getting the contract. For there to be a presumption of loss, the government has to actually have expended funds on a contract that you received. But the other penalties, including suspension and debarment, those don't require that you actually receive a contract. So there could be ramifications for making a false representation, even if that false representation didn't ultimately result in you obtaining a contract. So just be aware that these rules are pretty nuanced, can be rather confusing, and there can be some pretty significant consequences if you run afoul of them. So that is it for today's presentation. I appreciate you all taking the time to join me today to go through some of these rules, to discuss some of the developments and the changes in the law over the years, and sort of some of the landmines that you guys hopefully can avoid as you're navigating, maintaining your certifications in SAM, and you're going through your contracts and getting a good sense of when you have to recertify and what the ramifications of those recertifications are. I will say there's a lot of opportunity here for small businesses, given some of the recent changes to the law and some of those cases that I mentioned, to take advantage of these rules, to use them for your benefit, particularly in the mergers and acquisitions space. There is a lot of opportunity. So, talking to an attorney about how you might be able to position yourself for the future, for future growth, or growth through acquisition, while using some of these laws and rules to your advantage to maintain eligibility for orders issued under long-term contracts, and setting yourself up to have a long runway of bidding on some of these vehicles is a real possibility for any small businesses that are operating in this space. So feel free to reach out if you have any specific questions or you want to talk through today's presentation. I'm going to take a look now at the questions we received during the presentation, see if I can get through some of these. So just bear with me for a minute and I'll try to answer any questions that came in. So it looks like there's a question here about someone said if you win an 8A set-aside contract in your 6th year of the 8A program and you graduate after the usual 9 years, you won't be able to complete the final 2 options. No, the general rule for the 8A program is your size and status are locked in for life of the contract, so that shouldn't be a problem. Sam seems to request 3-year average of revenue. Haven't the rule been changed? Yeah, the full effect period for revenues is now 5 years. So I'm not sure why Sam is requesting a 3-year average. It should be 5. So that seems to be an error on their end. If that is information you're still getting prompted to answer. Okay, SBA recently changed the size standards for several NAICS codes. Our GSA schedule just exercised an option last year, so we have 4 years to wait for the next representation size. Is there any way to get GSA to recertify our size now so that we don't lose the next 4 years? So the SBA regulation indicates that if there's a size standard increase that goes into effect after a solicitation is issued, then the agency can, but is not required to add that size standard to the procurement. So in this case, if they just exercised your last option and you guys represented as a large business, then you might not be able to take advantage of it, but that is something, questions from PJ. Feel free to reach out to me offline. We might be able to talk through how you might be able to advocate for some opportunity here with GSA. So recertification at task order level under an award to a JV under a mentor-protege agreement. Is it correct that the exemption to size only applies as long as the mentor-protege is active? Therefore, if the mentor-protege expires during contract performance, no, so long as the mentor-protege was in place when you guys bid, that's when your size would be determined, unless there is a task order recertification. If there is a task order recertification and your mentor-protege is no longer in place, then you don't have the exception from affiliation, so you wouldn't be able to recertify as small. So Prime is a large business and has a small business contracting plan. So it's not really about, our presentation wasn't really about small business contracting plans, so I'll see if I can answer that. Prime awards a subcontract, and that small business certifies as small, but 1 year in, they no longer qualify as small via annual reps and certs. Is the Prime still able to count them as small through the life of the Prime contract? There's not a recertification requirement for subcontractors, and the general rule for subcontracting plans is that you can rely on the representation that your subcontractor made when you awarded them the subcontract. So you don't need to police their SAM update, and there's no recertification requirement for subcontracts. So you can rely on the original representation they made. Is a partial sale also a triggering event? Yeah, I mean, if you sell some of your, it depends, but yes, if you sell some of your assets, that triggers recertification. If a company got a GSA contract with a woman-owned small business and later certified as no longer woman-owned, and they still bid again, and they still bid and win woman-owned work on their GSA schedule, like that is going to depend on why you recertified as no longer woman-owned in connection with your GSA schedule. I'd be happy to talk through the specifics of that scenario and whether you might still be able to bid work if you want to shoot me an email. Asset sales don't require recertification. No, that's not true. If you're going through an asset sale and you are, structuring it so that another company is acquiring a contract and there's a contract novation, then you would be triggered by the novation rule, which requires recertification within 30 days of novation. Provide a PDF of the slides. I think the slides will be shared with everyone that attended. Looks like there's a question here regarding issues with SAM. I'm not aware of any leniency regarding inability to get timed reps and certs into SAM. I know there's been a lot of technical issues with the transition over with the new unique identifier numbers and things like that, but unfortunately, I'm not aware of anybody letting contractors off the hook for not being able to get information. There's an affirmative action plan question here. I don't know the answer to that one, but our labor and employment folks who do a lot of affirmative action issues might be able to answer that question. So Dina, feel free to shoot me an email. The slides will be distributed. You can send me an email about certificate for attendance. I'm not aware of that. Buying or selling? I'm not sure what the question is here. I think that's all the questions that I see. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everyone, again. If you are interested in discussing anything we talked about today, you want to talk more about these rules, you need help with a bid protest, or any procurement-related questions, feel free to shoot me an email. My contact information is here on this last slide, and I look forward to having you guys join us in another one of our webinars coming up soon. Thanks again so much, and take care, everybody.